what is reality? What's really out there? Is there a real objective world out there? Or is what we think of as out there only a creation of our minds? What would that mean? And so, right, is there a world that exists in itself independently of our minds? Or is there no world that exists in itself at all independently of our minds? Now, so if there is a world that exists in itself independently of our minds, is what we perceive and experience within our minds, what we perceive and experience, is that how the world actually exists in itself? Or does the world exist in itself independently of our minds, different than from how we actually perceive and experience it? All right. So there's a few different viewpoints to kind of address this concept of the nature of reality and our experience of it. These deal with what's called direct realism, indirect realism, and idealism. Okay, so the idea of direct realism would be to say that we experience the world directly as it is. As in, there is a real world out there, a real objective, independently existing, apart from our minds, world out there that exists. And the experience we have in our minds is a direct perception of it. The world in itself and the world we experience in our minds are the same thing to direct realism. We directly experience the world as it is, right? That's the premise of direct realism. Indirect realism would be to say that there is a real world existing independently of our minds, a real objective world out there, but the experience we actually have in our minds, what we actually perceive, isn't how the world actually exists in itself. That in itself, the world exists differently, and that our experience of the world is filtered by our minds and our biological faculties. So indirect realism would say that we only ever have an indirect experience of a world existing in itself. So indirect realism still says there is a real world out there in itself, but that we don't actually have a direct experience of it. We only ever have an indirect recreation of it within our minds. So our experience is an indirect perception of what we actually see and hear, and our whole sensorial, our whole world constructed in our minds isn't how the world is in itself, but that the world in itself still does exist and is real and has some objective properties. Okay, and we're going to talk a lot more about this, right? And then so idealism would be then to basically, in this context, idealism, when contrasted with direct realism and indirect realism, would then be to say that there isn't a world in itself, and that there is only that our minds, the world that we experience in our minds, is created by our minds, with no world in itself to exist objectively at all. That would be kind of the idea of how you would contrast the idealism in this context with direct realism and indirect realism. That indirect and direct realism say that there is a real objective world out there independently of our mind or of any mind, while idealism says the world we experience is only a creation of our minds, with nothing in itself, particularly nothing in itself fundamentally devoid of any mind or consciousness, which exists at all. Okay, right? And so, and there's a lot of talk about idealism here. I'm very fascinated by idealism, and so, there's a lot to say here. And so, that's one way to frame idealism in this particular context, when it's in the context opposed to direct and indirect realism, right? But so idealism can also be like a metaphysical ontological construct that in a context can be opposed to materialism or physicalism, kind of the same thing, and then dualism. So then, these are the basic metaphysical constructs. I got all kinds of videos talking about this too. And so materialism or physicalism. And so basically, they're basically saying the same thing, right? Materialism says that all is matter. Physicalism says all is a product of physics. Well, what's physics? And so it kind of expands into sort of encompassing ideas in quantum mechanics while holding on to the materialist dogma without saying it's material. So, it's physical. And but I'd have to get into a lot of details and really work on a lot of that and that's really important because it all comes down to, well, then what's physics? And I'm going to get into a little bit of that here, but what is, you're saying everything's just a product of physics, so it depends on how you define physics. It's a pretty vague statement. And so if you define physics in two different ways, well then, because you could still say, and even an idealist who says the world is all a product of mind could still say there's the physics of this mind, and then which completely changes the notion. It says, well, I'm a physicalist, and that's why I feel to people, I don't remember the guy's name, but he, has a view called physicalistic idealism. All right, but this is getting a little too far into what we're talking about here. So we can just stick with like materialism, a little basic construct. Materialism, all is just matter. All is just a material world fundamentally devoid of consciousness. That what there is fundamentally is some objective world that exists in itself, which exists fundamentally devoid of consciousness. The physical world you can think of, right? Some material world. It's kind of the general notion of mainstream philosophy and science. There's a physical material world that exists in itself, fundamentally devoid of the mind, right? And so that's basically, and so materialism or physicalism would basically be a construct that says that the fundamental substance of existence is matter, is something in itself fundamentally devoid of mind. And so then it's like, okay, so then what's the mind? And then in that view, the mind is derivative of the matter. It is wholly dependent on matter. Material substance comes first, is the fundamental substance to the materialist. That's the construct of that view, and the world of consciousness is only derivative of that, which is different from dualism, particularly substance dualism here, which would say that no, the mind is its own fundamentally distinct substance. That there is a material world in itself, according to dualism, and the mind is a fundamentally distinct substance, not derivative of the material world. Okay, right? It is its own separate thing. So the materialist just thinks the mind is derivative of the material world. The substance dualist says, no, the mind is its own independent substance, not derivative of the material world. Okay? Now, so idealism in this context would be saying that what we perceive as the material world is only derivative of the fundamental substance of the mind. So the mind is the fundamental substance, and that what we perceive as a material world is only derivative of that. So you have basically materialism says the material world is the fundamental substance. The mind is derivative of that. Idealism says the mind is the fundamental substance. The material world is derivative of that. Dualism, substance dualism, would say that they're each their own distinct substance is fundamental, and neither is derivative of the other. Okay? And so then you kind of have these basic constructs, because this is important to work with when it really comes to the ideas of direct realism, indirect realism, and idealism. And so idealism is the same word here, and it does kind of mean the same thing. But it's when there's different types of idealism contrasted in these different in these different contexts. And plus, there's just all different types of interpretations of idealism. And also, there's also idealism, the idea of pursuing unrealistic ideals at the detriment of practicality, which has nothing to do with this. Okay? So, where do we start? All right, so we got So then that's kind of how you would contrast idealism with materialism, physicalism, and with dualism, substance dualism. And I'll get why that's an important distinction later, because there's other types of dualism. But, so we have these basic constructs, right? And so idealism would generally, in contrasted with direct realism and indirect realism, would basically be kind of saying that there is no independent world out there outside of the human mind. Now, it's the human mind's an important qualifier here, because there's other types of idealism which would be called like objective idealism, which would posit an objective world outside of the human mind. So then it wouldn't necessarily be right to say that that is very much fundamentally distinct from kind of indirect realism, if it's still, it's not saying the human mind is only the creator of the human experience, that there is an objective world that still exists in itself, but that world in itself, according to objective idealism, is mind in itself. Okay? And I'll cover more on this in another story here, but I mean, we'll get into this a little more, don't you worry, okay? I want to clear all this up. Or at least some of it up, right? It's a lot to clear up, This is a pretty hefty topic here. All right, so then, when we're talking about indirect realism, so that's why it's important to get that, okay, so indirect realism, direct realism, and then idealism. Idealism could be one way described as what's called subjective idealism, in that the human mind is the creator of the human experience, and there's really nothing outside the human mind to create the human experience, which then obviously, how do different humans all have the same experience would be an important construct to address for subjective idealism. But there's not only subjective idealism, there's objective idealism, which basically says there is an objective world independently of the human mind, right? And so it's like, well, is that still a realism in that perspective? It still posits a real world out there, right? And so this is an important distinction to get here. But and then I'll make this a little more clear as we go on here on spelling out my position. Because the position I'm going to spell out here is more or less a form of objective idealism. So it's important, and then I'm going to get into why indirect realism and the mainstream notion of what they think is going on, built off of materialism and physicalism. I'll cover substance dualism in another video. But because materialism and physicalism are basically the mainstream notion of, or the common notion of mainstream philosophy and science, mainstream science, right? It's not just, and I'll cover more in another video on how that came to be, and a little more details on that. But so we're going to start with, I think it's a little past starting at this point, actually. But we're going to go and start over with kind of the idea of indirect realism, because I'm going to kind of spell this out, and it's important to get why indirect realism is kind of the mainstream belief system. The indirect realism, particularly based off of physicalism and idealism. No, sorry. Indirect realism based off of the premise of physicalism and materialism is the mainstream notion, okay, right? And so that view basically says that there is an objective world out there. There's a world that exists independently of our minds, right? Independently of the human minds. That's a pretty core construct of, very basic assumption of mainstream science and philosophy, right? And then that, there is a physical world that exists out there, okay, right? And then so this world, in their interpretation, has certain physical properties, and then because these views precede Einstein's theory of relativity, it's also generally described as these physical properties of things like weight, motion, time. But then we can say, with relativity, that the weight, motion, and time is still relative to the subjective reference frame, right? But they still have the basic construct of indirect realism that there is a physical world out there, which is basically of time, space, and matter, right? That's kind of the general idea. Some sort of world exists out there. And then the reason why it's indirect realism is because they think some world exists out there, but our minds and our biological faculties interpret it and create an experience in our minds. They think it's reduced to our brains. We'll get into that. That doesn't exactly match it. And so a great way to show an example of this is the mainstream theory on color, right? So the basic idea is that color doesn't exist in the world in itself, right? What exists in the world in itself are certain wavelengths of light, right? That, the color red doesn't exist in the world in itself. The color red is a creation in your mind, but what exists in itself is certain wavelengths of light. And that through your eyes and your brain, your biological faculties, you take those wavelengths of light and recreate an experience of color in your mind. Okay, right? And so that's why it's indirect realism, that we don't perceive the world directly as it exists. And then obviously optical illusions and everything, kind of, you think you perceive a world that kind of this image is happening, but the world in itself isn't like that, right? And so if it was direct realism, there kind of wouldn't be optical illusions, because then that would be saying that you have a direct perception, but you don't. It's filtered through your biological faculties, which it would include, and particularly in the materialistic perspective, your brain working, creating your mind. Okay, right? And so, and also a good way to show why indirect realism is the mainstream view is there's also we don't see all of the electromagnetic spectrum, only a small portion of it that they call visible light that we see. It's visible. And we don't hear the entire acoustic spectrum. But other animals, by virtue of their biological faculties, can see and hear different things, giving them a different perception, a different experience of the same world, right? So they would have a different perception in their minds, a different experience in their minds of the same world. So, it kind of shows that we're not directly experiencing this one world. We're only experiencing this world based on filtering of our biological faculties, right? That there's a world in itself that has all this kind of, they describe it as physical properties, and you can think of it, wavelengths of light, matter, and time and space, whatever you think exists in itself, and that through our biological faculties created out of this world, we then interpret and recreate an image in our brains and our minds, and then brains to them, that that's what we really experience, but the world in itself isn't exactly like that. It's the recreation in our brains, right? It's a recreation in our minds. That, the wavelengths of light aren't directly how we experience it. We experience color, but the color doesn't exist in the world in itself. We create the color via biological faculties in our minds, right? Okay, so that's indirect realism. And that, right, that's pretty clearly the mainstream perspective, right? Okay. And so the basic, this world says that there is a world in itself, and they generally describe with the physical properties. It has these certain characteristics, and of existing in itself, and then through having those characteristics, it created life. Life evolved. Then life evolved to create an experience within this physical world, and that experience is then created through the processing in the brains of that life. And right, so this is where, so they think that the conscious experience comes out of, there's all different interpretations of it. This is the mainstream view, is it comes out of, it's like the neurocomputation model, comes out of the brain states, through states of the brain interacting, through the electrical signals in the brain, through, whatever the synapses and the, exchange of information in the brain, through, the electrical signaling and the neurons in the brain, emerges the conscious experience. And the conscious experience is reduced to the interactions of the brain. That there is nothing more to the conscious experience than the interactions of the brain. That, it can be reduced to the interactions of the brain. And so there is a physical world out there which exists in itself, which created life somehow, and life evolved somehow to create a mechanism in which it which creates interactions which produce the conscious experience. And so this view doesn't allow for free will. It's an important premise to understand here, right? This view doesn't allow for what the mind is to affect what they posit as what the physical world is. Because they posit some physical world to exist in itself, fundamentally devoid of consciousness. That's how we're defining a physical world in this sense. Some sort of world existing in itself, fundamentally devoid of consciousness. Okay? And so they posit that to exist in itself, which either works through some core fundamental laws, or also some degree of randomness is sometimes posited. But basically, that world exists, and then through creation of life and the evolution of life, their consciousness arises just out of those interactions in life, the interactions of neuronal electrical signals in life, in the brains of life, how exactly that begins in life, and I don't know, there's controversy over that, but the idea is through some sort of interaction, through some chemical computation, or whatever you want to call it, of life, consciousness comes about, and that the conscious experience is derivative of what the material substance does, right? And so this view is called epiphenomenalism and the idea is that consciousness is only an epiphenomenon, meaning that it's like just a byproduct. It's something produced by the material world and caused by the material world, but which doesn't have the ability to cause change in the material world. Because the idea is there's a material physical world existing in itself, and that it works through its laws or a little bit of randomness, and that the consciousness just emerges from that. But there's no way for the consciousness, the experience, to actually cause the action in the material world, because the material world is said to be working through its laws, or maybe to a little bit of randomness, right? And so the conscious experience in this view is just like this illusion created out of what they think of as a world fundamentally existing without consciousness. Okay? Right? You see what I'm saying here? That it's just something that's produced in your brain, produced by your brain, and that's all it really is. And that you think you're going about your day making choices and consciously causing action through your own volition. But that's just an illusion. Because really everything's just the physical material world running its course. And the conscious experience which emerges out of it doesn't interact, it doesn't cause change within it. Because then you'd have to incorporate that into the laws of physics. Because physics is supposed to account for how everything works. So if the mind in itself can cause change in the physical structure, if you want to have a comprehensive account of how all physical structure and all causation of physical structure works, and the mind has the ability to actually cause change in physical structure, you have to account for that in physics. And if you don't, then you don't have either a complete story. So by trying to have a complete story of physics, they would say, well, the mind can't do that then, right? And that's the basic viewpoint. Because the mind is only something, in this view, that just is produced out of it as an illusion, right? It's not, the fundamental substance of the universe is just this non-mental, non-conscious physical interaction. And so that's what there is. And so it just creates mind as a byproduct of it. And that's just how, and so the mind doesn't have the ability to feed back and cause change in the physical structure. Right? That's why it's an illusion, just created out of it. And this idea of the feedback is very critical here. Wait, 1 second, I'm gonna take a drink of water. Get all worked up on this, right? So I gotta figure out where I am here. So we're going over indirect realism, and so all right, we're good on that, right? You get it, and that's the premise, and that's why mainstream science doesn't allow for free will. It's not like a secret. No, they don't. Look into it. It's not. I studied philosophy in college. I was told this very explicitly. I get it. That's the position. If you're going to posit that the world exists in itself as physical substance, fundamentally devoid of mind, fundamentally non-conscious, that viewpoint doesn't allow for the consciousness to then input and affect what there is. And that is their viewpoint. That's not some backwards criticism. I mean, that's what they admit. That's what they say themselves. These people don't, these people who really take seriously their philosophy and who call themselves materialists or physicalists don't allow for free will. It's not part of their philosophy. These illusionists of consciousness, these epiphenomenalists, don't allow for free will. It's not part of their viewpoint. It can't happen, right? Even though they go about their day freely willing things all day, they don't think that's real. I don't know how they live their life. Well, it seems kind of bland and dreary and weird to me. But that's what these people ironically choose to do. Ironic, obviously, because making the choice, they're kind of denying their whole philosophy, aren't they? Yeah, I think so. And so I think, if you have the choice, or at least think you have the choice, you might as well choose the one that allows choice, which would throw away physicalism, that's for sure, and epiphenomenalism, which is basically just a result of physicalism. And this is why, okay, so let's get into the difference between substance dualism and property dualism. Because epiphenomenalism, the idea that there's a material world existing in itself and then consciousness just emerges as a byproduct in the brain, it can be called a property dualism because they think that there is the mental world of property. There is a world of mental properties, and there's a world of physical properties, but the world of mental properties is only caused by the world of physical properties. And so everything is fundamentally physical substance, but through physical substance, there's the illusion of consciousness and mental so that's why it's a property dualism, because it's dualism because they think there is the conscious experience, which isn't fundamentally in itself physical, but it's caused by the physical, which is different from substance dualism, which thinks consciousness is something entirely different and not directly caused by the physical. Okay? And so what the indirect realists would really have to answer then is, what is the reality in itself, right? If you're saying that we don't, if our experience, the world we actually perceive and experience and, what we think of as our reality is only the creation in our brain states and can be reduced to the brain states through a world that's, in the world that exists in itself, something fundamentally different. What is that world that actually exists in itself? What really exists outside of our biological faculties interpreting what there is, right? And so they would, this is where, the physical properties comes in the world of generally time, space, and matter, right? And so, right? And so, but then we really got to get into, what is this world of time, space, matter? What are these things? What makes the physical world, right? And so here's where we get into kind of shifting over into where I can present my view. And so, what really is out there, right? And when you look and you try to, it's just a microscope, or a high-powered microscope, or particle accelerator, right? Okay, whatever. And you look down, you keep going, you try to find, what our world is really made of, right? look, let's just try to figure out what this thing really is, okay, right? And then you keep going down, you look, and then, you think, okay, right, now if you're a real true materialist, very well, the world is a material substance. That's what it is. I mean, that's what it appears like. It's solid, it's material. That's what it is in itself, right? Okay. But you look down and keep going and going and going down and you find the smallest little bit of material. And at one point they thought they were going to find this, right? Find the smallest bit of material out there. Like, what is there you're going to find? And that's like the thing that you can't break. That's the essence. That's the fundamental substance of materiality. Some sort of smallest literal particle that is in itself material. But that's not exactly what they find here, all right? They keep going down and finding, and what they don't see, they get down to these subatomic particles, they don't see a material thing here. They see waves and they see spin in the field, right? It's some sort of, and they call that a particle because it's something there, but it's like a spin in the field. It's not an actual, we're tricky on the word physical. I would say not really a material thing here, right? It's something, it's a spin in the field. And so, what is this field? And this is where you gotta, okay, so the kind of mainstream view is that you talk about the fine-tuned universe. So what are the laws of physics? And they've kind of gone and looked and they say there's gravity, there's electromagnetism, and there's the strong nuclear force, there's the weak nuclear force, and these are the four fundamental forces, right? And they kind of have them as if there's different things. And then, the fine-tuned universe has these different sort of, there's other aspects of physics, and it just works out to be exactly like this, right? And that these are just kind of arbitrary constructs that just work out like this. But it doesn't really make any sense, right? I mean, why? Because why would that be the case? Just arbitrary constructs that just happen to work out. And then so, it's, and some people point, well, then there's got to be a designer. And then, okay, well, because it's so fine-tuned, right? If you just change one of these arbitrary constructs just a tiny bit, it changes the whole thing. But it's these arbitrary constructs are just their own sort of human extrapolation of all this. It's not arbitrary. So they find what other physicists have found is that you really get down to it, everything kind of emerges from what they can call the space. So you think of it that an atom, you ever heard it described as 99.999% empty space, right? And that's what it was considered for a while. It was just empty space. And that and then there's something else that's real, and there's these particles that are just material things in empty space, okay? But that's not exactly what they found. This empty space isn't empty. It's actually full of energy. And it exists in this geometrically balanced array, right? And so that's the idea here, is that empty space is not, there's not, okay, so let me hold up. There's kind of the structure of space that exists in this perfectly balanced geometric array, like the flower of life pattern. And then, it's kind of all this geometry on this balanced array of geometry. And this is, it's the fundamentally balanced. This is just the way it would be, because it's, this is exactly how you would arrange spheres, which is, the most basic shape, right? It's got no side, and it's a perfect circle or a perfect sphere, right? And then, the way they're overlapping to create the most space-filling geometric array. And so part of the construct here is that this geometry in itself exists fundamentally beyond any one space-time world, beyond any one particular reality. It is an eternal geometric set, because it's multiple universes could use the same geometric patterning. This geometric patterning isn't dependent on any one particular space-time reality. So it's beyond space and time itself. It is eternal because it's beyond time. It's not, only a matter of time. It's not only a manifestation within time. It is beyond time. And then so the premise here is that everything comes out of this fundamental balanced geometry, which collapses in on itself. And then that creates the spin, which we observe as certain particles. And then, all these particles are which makes up everything. So everything is created by this fundamental eternal set of geometry collapsing, spinning in on itself. And this creates all waves, vibrations, and frequency, and it's all kind of the same thing. I mean, waves have frequencies, and the vibrations can be transcribed as waves. And it's all that. So it's all the fundamental geometric construct in itself, which is fundamentally beyond time, and that and then spinning in on itself creates basically a space-time world, right? And then, so everything's, it creates a universe based on spinning in on itself, and everything stems from this fundamental geometry, right? And so it's kind of like, these are all universes, and this geometry kind of spins, and it's all this fractalization, and all these, so what's out there is all this created from this geometry. And but what really, and then, okay, all right. Let me take another sip of water here. I'm back. All right, so what are we really talking about here? And eventually, so the key here is really in the feedback. All right, so how exactly we tie in all this geometry to the feedback loops? That's a good question. And so that's what I'm saying. So the mainstream view just thinks that there is a world in itself of matter, right? And that matter, through working through whatever it does, somehow created life, which then somehow created, evolved, and that life evolved, and the consciousness is a product of the interactions of the basically chemical substances of the life, and that it's just an emergent thing. It's a byproduct created because somehow it decides to, somehow it would just emerge out of that. I mean, that's their theory. It's like non-conscious world, somehow it just becomes conscious of itself, but the conscious, and it just like happens to do it, and that consciousness is kind of a meaningless byproduct of it. So the universe exists fundamentally non-conscious, just happen to become conscious to the point where it thinks it can change the way the world is. But no, that's just an illusion. It's just kind of a weird view. But that's the mainstream premise. And so a lot of people buy into that. You ask most people, they'd say, oh yeah, the brain generates consciousness, right? The world's non-conscious. And then through life and the evolution of life, somewhere along that way, consciousness is produced by the life, and the states of consciousness can be reduced to the workings of the chemical composition of the life substances, right? And consciousness, there's basically the complexity of brain states emerges consciousness out of what was fundamentally non-conscious. And so the premise here is, it's not, what's out there is not a fundamentally non-conscious substance, right? It's conscious in itself. So consciousness was within everything. Consciousness doesn't just come out of non-consciousness, okay? Consciousness is within all that exists. So we go back and then talk about the geometry and how the geometry is the fundamental. That there is an eternal geometric set, the sacred geometry, and that's really the essence. And then the expansion and contraction of kind of the geometry spinning in and collapsing in itself, and then spinning out of itself. That's the fundamental process of all physics, of all there is. It's all from its core, that kind of sacred geometry, that basic eternal set of geometry, and that creates all matter, waves, vibration, basically, out of that core set of geometry. It's not arbitrary physical laws. It's all a foundation in sacred geometry, and that creates everything through what is. So it's like the atom is 99% empty space, right? And it's the geometry is that space. The empty space is the perfectly balanced geometry, and when it's not empty space, it's a spinning of that geometric field. Okay, right? And so, and that's what there is, right? And that's what we perceive as the material world, is the spinning of the geometric field. And then, so that does exist, that would be what would you could say exists in itself, is the spinning of some geometric field. And then, okay. But consciousness is, so any state of spin within the field has a consciousness. There's an awareness of that spin in the field. And then the little bits of spin can aggregate into bigger states of spin. And then there's an awareness of those bigger states of spin. And they're embedded fractally, right? Which is, right? Little states of spin of subatomic particles aggregate in atoms. And then states of spin aggregate into molecules, and aggregate into cells, and you aggregate into organisms, and, right? And there's, okay. And then so, because it all comes out of that fundamental geometry, which exists in itself beyond space and time, and there's a constant communication back and forth between the manifest states of spin, which create space and time fields, and then the fundamental state beyond space and time. It's constant back and forth. There's just always a communication process there between eternal construct beyond space and time and manifest form of space and time. And so all manifest everything that's created out of states of spin of the field is constantly in communication with that which is beyond it. And so states of consciousness is all states of spin within the field have their consciousness. Consciousness doesn't just emerge arbitrarily based on some sort of complex, based on brain computation when it comes complex enough. That there is consciousness within everything. And so there's just you can think a small amount of, particular states of consciousness are still associated with particular states of spin and complexity. So that's why there's a correlation between your brain states and your states of consciousness. Because it's not kind of the substance dualists would say they're two separate things. It's all the geometry and the experience of the geometry. Okay? It's not the substance dualism, and so that's why there is the correlation still between your states of being and your states of consciousness. The arrangements of the geometric field arranges itself in the brain states, which has specific states of consciousness for a human. Okay, right? And so all right. And so the feedback, we got to get to the feedback, because that's the key here of how there's free will and everything, right? And why consciousness isn't just the epiphenomenon. Because it's all conscious states, and then it kind of grows to have different states of consciousness within it. And so, like, there's the consciousness of an atom, and the consciousness of a cell, and the consciousness of a planet, and of a sun, a star, and the consciousness of a human. So the consciousness of the human, or and typically considered biological life, is a particular arrangement of that field and particular information and geometric states within it. And that's what creates that particular consciousness, right? Okay? So, right, that's why, which makes it different than, so there's, consciousness is a general construct, and then there's particular states of it through different arrangements of it. But all arrangements of it are the consciousness. It's just, different arrangements of it are different states, right? And then, so that's why, our human state is this real, it's like complex again, but particular arrangement of the field of geometry spinning in certain ways and communicating with itself. That's key. The feedback. I'll get to that. And then, so that's why our particular consciousness of a human is the way it is, right? Yeah, okay, sure. And then, so the feedback loop, this is what's really cool, is there's a constant exchange of the information. So everything is in a constant communication. It's the back and forth between the manifest beyond space and time point, and beyond space and time, and the manifest form of particular spins within it. Okay? And so it's always that there's always that constant back and forth of the communication, which creates that feedback, and that all states. So it's like all arrangements are, there's a particular arrangement. It's all informed what everything else is doing constantly based on that back and forth communication. So every point is aware of the whole, and the whole is aware of every point through that communication feedback. And then you break it down like information, which is basically the states of spin and geometry. And I also say the information for consciousness. And so, because ultimately, I would say that there is, well, maybe I should get into that later. But, because I said it's like objective idealism. And so there is the fundamental consciousness beyond any particular state, which you could call like universal consciousness. And that's the name Lowry and Borman give in their paper, The Nonlocal Universe. And we got to get into that. Non-locality is a big part of all this, right? Okay, so let's get into that. And that's important to do with the feedback, right? And so the idea of non-locality, okay, this is the important construct and really helps connect it all, is that, so locality would be that things can only cause change in other things if they interact within space and time. That something can't cause change somewhere else unless it sends a signal or physically, and the signal would be physical in this belief, that, unless there's some sort of direct interaction mediated through space and time. And that would be the basic, there can't be action at a distance. It's a core construct of the way mainstream science was built on. Okay? Until quantum mechanics came along. But the philosophy still lingers, right? Because materialism definitely doesn't take that into account. And mainstream notions of physicalism don't either. Because non-locality is the idea of that there can be action caused not directly mediated through space and time. And that's what quantum entanglement's all about. Okay? And then quantum entanglement violates locality. So there is they observe a state of spin of a certain particle or certain spin in the field, and that can change the state of spin in the field somewhere else faster than the speed of light, faster than a physical signal could travel, right? And so that must violate locality. There's all kinds of stuff on this, Bell's inequalities and all that shit. I wasn't going to say shit. Fuck! I said it again. But, okay, so there's all that. Okay, so non-locality would be the idea that things can be affected, not directly mediated through space and time. And then and that's part of how everything emerges from that field beyond space and time, right? So everything comes out of what you could call the vacuum state, what you could call the fundamental balance geometry beyond space and time, and is in a constant communication with that. And so everything can be aware of all other points and be affected by them because of that constant interaction of the communication between manifest form of space and time networks and of the point beyond space and time. So there's a point beyond space and time that is aware of all that happens created within a context of space and time. Okay? So in this sense, space and time aren't absolute and don't exist in themselves, because it's all a construct. What's absolute and exists in itself is fundamentally the geometry beyond space and time. But you could still say that, that gets really tricky, there's a little bit of nuance and let's just finish up on non-locality first, because it's very technical whether you want to say that the field exists in itself. I would say the field in itself is conscious, and that consciousness is ultimate reality. And so my view is more that, there's an infinite mind. There is no space and time in itself, right? Any manifest form that perceives a space-time world is beyond. No, scratch that. Let's go back to non-locality. This is confusing stuff, man. Okay. I wrote the paper on it. I'll link it in the comments here. And so, non-locality and the feedback. So the idea here that I'm really trying to communicate is, you got the mainstream notion of indirect realism, which posits a world fundamentally of space and time. Right? And they say, well, given Einstein's theory of relativity, space and time aren't absolute. Okay, it's relative, but it's not really well incorporated in their philosophy, particularly. The mainstream view has relativity, it has quantum mechanics, which a lot of them are interpretations of quantum mechanics to begin with. Even, it's hard to say that there's one mainstream one. If there was, it'd be the Copenhagen interpretation, which kind of doesn't really mesh well with. So there's just kind of all a mess. But, the mainstream philosophy of physicalism, or of materialism, is more so there is a world out there of matter and time and space, which exists in itself fundamentally non-conscious. And that this world creates consciousness through particular arrangements and chemical computations of brain states, right? And that can be all reduced to that. And then the conscious experience is just this epiphenomenon, this byproduct created out of it, without the ability to change and cause change within it, to feed back and cause a change. And that's what the feedback. So the premise here is that everything that's, the world is not a fundamentally non-conscious substance. It is a fundamentally conscious substance, and it's all arising from the core geometric set and spinning out of it in a constant communication of it. So that every point can be informed by every other point. Because there's an inherent awareness of a point beyond space and time of what everything that manifests within a form of space and time does. Okay? And so there can be an effect and a change caused by different points, and that, within the field, not directly mediated through space and time because of that. Okay? And that's how entanglement can occur. But it also manifests through, it travels through a wormhole. But it's kind of the same thing here. Okay? And then that's how it works, right? And so the idea of the feedback is so that our experience isn't just something contained in our brains, produced by, as an epiphenomenon in our brains. Our experience informs the whole. And that, so it feeds back into the whole system. Our experience isn't something just like contained in our heads, isolated from the way the universe works. The universe works as a conscious system. So it's aware of every point, and it's aware of all experience. And so our experience feeds back into the whole system. So the universe is this process of geometry and spin, which you could break down and say it's information. And everything is this flow of information, of geometry and spin, of this communication between the point, perfectly balanced geometric array and the states of spin it creates of universes, right? And so all these are universes, okay? And they're all connected. Right? Not all this jumbled. Okay, and then so our experience feeds back into the universe, and that's how it plays a role. So it's in that constant communication, and that's how the universe is aware of our experience. And that's how it plays the role within the universe. Is because consciousness isn't just generated out of a universe which is fundamentally non-conscious as some epiphenomenon of brain states. Instead, the universe is a fundamentally conscious system through information, spin, and feedback, which then somehow creates our experience, which is then feeding back. Our experience feeds back into the universe. So it matters to the universe. And then ultimately, how we can cause change is because the change is caused from the point beyond space and time. And we are that fundamental consciousness which exists beyond space and time, able to cause the change within the manifest forms of space and time. And so, let me read something real quick. And so that's really the key concept to get. And so I'd take it even farther and say that everything exists as a product of the one fundamental consciousness. Let me read this real quick. So this is from the Nonlocal Universe paper. I'll link it in the comments. And then, so they have the premise of non-local realism. And that's what I'm kind of saying here is that, is there a real world outside the human mind? Well, yeah, there's a real world of geometry and spin, of the fundamental consciousness creating all that. Okay? And so, it's not that we create, is there a world that exists in itself fundamentally of matter? Fundamentally of a physical world in itself fundamentally devoid of consciousness? No. But is there something out there to which creates our perceptions and to which we create it back? Yes. And so, what's out there is the information flow of geometry and spin, all emanating and in constant communication with the point beyond space and time itself. And so, and it's in that constant feedback, and then so that's how our experience feeds back and creates it. So our experience isn't just created in our heads. Our experience is the experience of the whole universe. And it influences how the universe creates itself. Because if our experience was just in our heads, that doesn't really make sense. Like, what are you talking about? No, my experience is out here. Not in my head. Right? because this experience is part of the way the universe works through experience. So in one facet, it works through geometry information, but then experience, every little point has an experience which feeds back into the geometry information structure. So it's kind of a dual aspect monism. A lot to say about that, but it's all fundamentally the infinite mind. So what's the fundamental substance of the universe? My perspective would be, it is mind. There isn't anything that exists in itself fundamentally devoid of mind, of consciousness. Consciousness is the fundamental substance, and perhaps this fundamentally balanced substance is the ultimate consciousness, which then creates particular states of consciousness out of it. And it's all, through the distortions and the spin of it, right? And so it's all... And so the space and time fields that it creates out of it don't exist in themselves as space and time fields. And then, right? So what... It's tricky. So it exists. There's this geometry that exists. And so how do you have space without geometry? Well, I don't think you can have space without geometry. But how do you have geometry without space? Okay, because it's right. How do you have what consensus geometry if there's no, this is spatial relationships, right? And so it doesn't exist in itself as space. This fundamental pattern beyond particular space-time fields exists conceptually within an infinite mind of existence. Okay? And then it kind of gets into like Plato's forms and a lot of that stuff. I mean, there's a lot to get into, and it's hard to just ramble all this off, This is some good stuff, man. I mean, this is thousands of years of philosophy work here. And I'm only just trying to work on my understanding. I don't got it all figured out, right? But I think that's the key is, the feedback that our experience feeds back into the informational structure of the universe. It's not just something isolated, contained within our brains. It's huge. Because the reality in itself isn't something fundamentally non-conscious. It's conscious in itself. Okay? And so let me read from this little excerpt from this paper that I read. And so, this comes from the Nonlocal Universe paper by Lowry and Borman, or Borham, I don't know. But I'll get it right. I put it right in the paper, obviously I looked at it, I just don't remember. Borman. No, I didn't think the paper was boring. But, and so their premise is non-local realism. And that's the idea that there is something real to the universe, that, it's not just only our human minds creating our experience out of nothing, as if, you say indirect realism, direct realism, idealism. Idealism, it could mean in that sense that there's no real world out there at all. But then it's like, well, then how do we create our perceptions? What gives us our perceptions? And how do we stay connected to other conscious beings, right? If there's no reality outside of ourselves, what connects us all, and how do we create? Why, I'm not just creating whatever I want. I'd stay stuck in this world, man. And sometimes I wish I weren't. You know how it is. And so, right? And so that's where the premise is non-local realism, that the universe is a real thing. There's something real to the basis of our perceptions. But what this isn't fundamentally local, as in it's not just of a space and time in itself, only through only through interaction of a physical world in itself of space and time where everything isn't connected to a point beyond space and time. So it's everything being connected to what's fundamentally beyond the space and time that allows for that feedback communication, which is the basis of the non-local. And so it's like these information sets. They don't use information, they use meaning, but I'm just connecting it back to the other work of the unified physics that uses the word information. It's a lot to get into there, right? And so What fundamentally exists is these information sets of these spins of geometry, which exists conceptually within a mind of existence, the infinite mind of existence. Because there is no world in itself beyond the infinite mind of existence, but that doesn't mean our human mind creates our reality out of nothing. The infinite mind of existence creates the space-time field, and the space-time field is ultimately held within the infinite mind of existence. And then our particular arrangements within the field create our perception of a space-time world. Okay? Sure. And so their premise here is, non-local realism is closely related to the view espoused by Erwin Schrödinger. Schrödinger, you know who he is, right? How do you say the name? I don't know. I'm not German. Was he German? Why am I even saying this stuff? I don't know what I'm talking about. Does it matter? I mean, I know about Schrödinger, but I don't really study this stuff like... Well, I do. I study this stuff a lot, but never mind. The overall number of minds within the universe is just one. Should I start the sentence over? Probably. Non-local realism is closely related to the view espoused by Erwin Schrödinger. That's words hard as to Schrödinger. I know the name, but it's like Schrödinger. It's just, I have trouble saying it, okay? That the overall number of minds within the universe is just one. He went further by suggesting that the mind has erected the physical outside world out of its own mental stuff. The interconnected universal consciousness implied by the concept of one mind constitutes the non-local, singular, implicit reality of universal consciousness that has embedded within itself the local and explicit conscious minds of each individual. So this is saying is, the universal consciousness, which is the infinite mind, fundamentally beyond any one particular space-time world, that's how I interpret it, is non-local, singular, implicit reality. And within that fundamental infinite mind of universal consciousness comes about particular arrangements which it creates, which have perceptions of being within these particular space-time worlds. Okay? But everything is ultimately the infinite mind of universal consciousness creating states of geometry within a field. So the infinite mind of consciousness works through geometric patterning, through the fundamental core construct, and then it just all comes back to, it all is constant interaction with, and then it creates these informational patterns, these geometric patterns within what is fundamentally its mind of existence. And it creates these patterns, which within these patterns and that constant feedback comes about particular states of consciousness, which have the perceptions of being embedded within a local world of space and time. All right, sure. Okay, and that's the big key difference. Okay, so in some sense you could say, what's really out there? You could say, well, what's out there isn't a world of physical substance fundamentally devoid of consciousness, but is a field of informational patterning, of geometry and informational patterning. And that through that, we exist. And so we look down, we look in our world, and if we really look close enough, we can find the informational patterning. Everything's just informational patterning. But then we don't directly experience that exactly, right? We experience, so that's where it kind of relates to indirect realism. Indirect realism would say that what exists is this physical substance, and they basically, kind of have an idea of a geometric field. But their idea of the geometric field isn't something in itself conscious, and it doesn't have everything back and forth communicating to a point beyond. They don't have the idea that everything comes out of that vacuum state. Okay? And they don't have the idea that there is a fundamental core construct, sacred geometry, beyond space and time. Because the materialism evolved as a way to not say that. Because obviously, when you really start talking about infinite mind fundamentally beyond space and time, that's omniscient, you get closer to the concepts of spirituality and God. And they didn't want to do that. And so I think this view, it does relate to those core constructs. Idealism is something spelled out in ancient philosophies, Indian philosophies, ancient Greek philosophies, all kinds of kind of stuff like that. And then, like Hermeticism, that's the first construct, all is mind, right? And then, as above, so below, would be kind of that fractal energy pattern, that it's all based on that same energy patterning, same geometric patterning. All is vibration. It's all that constant back and forth, creating the vibration of the spin of the geometry and creating those fields. And so, while the indirect realism perspective would say that there is this world existing in itself, of a space-time world, and then consciousness created out of it as this epiphenomenon, with no ability for the conscious experience to feedback and affect what's out there. This view, the view I'm trying to spell out here, would say that what's really out there is a world of geometry patterning coming out of this field, this constant interaction back and forth with the field, and through which is essentially an exchange of information, a constant back and forth exchange of information of those aware, of manifest form and beyond manifest form, beyond space and time. And so that all experience is part of that information feedback. And so that our experience informs the whole field, and the whole field informs us in that constant exchange, right? And then it creates, for whatever reason, we're just having this particular experience that worked out like this. Why did the universe create this particular experience as these humans on Earth and doing all this stuff? I don't know. But there's also more to it, which is why, So, it's talking about, so I think this does relate to, it's idealism, and then I think it does relate to certain interpretations of theism. Okay, right? Sure. And then, I don't support the institutionalized religions because I think they kind of corrupted this message on purpose a little bit. But I do think the basic spiritual teachings, going back far enough before institutionalized religions, governments really got a hold and try to control the narrative and control that. And they did so. And one of the things they did was try to, how do these people know so much in the past, right? This is pretty good stuff here. Like, how did they get all this good philosophy? Well, they said it came from the gods a lot of the time. And they built these big structures, and they built this stuff. They said it came from the gods, and then you really see all these structures built, and all this geometry, and these creates there is ley lines of the earth, and it creates like this basic geometric grid pattern of the earth, because it's all this fundamental geometry, which all has to do with this energy, and then they build these pyramids on these ley lines, and it cultivates this energy. And so, they weren't just slaves building these things as tombs, right? And so originally the religions try to cover this up and say there weren't other gods, there's just the one God. And well, sure, yeah, there's the one infinite mind of creation, one infinite consciousness, and the sacred geometry, and everything comes out of that universal consciousness. But then there's also these stories of these gods, and what were these gods? Well, they were other beings within the universe, right? And so The religions try to cover that up. Mainstream science tries to cover that up. And why? Well, that's a good question. But we're not going to get into all that here. But that's good stuff here. And that's why, you got to be skeptical. So while I do think this position strongly advocates for spirituality and theism, it doesn't really, I don't like the institutionalized religions because I don't trust them so much. But there are a lot of good stuff here. And it all relates to that. And so it's important is our experience isn't something just created by our brains out of a non-conscious universe. Consciousness is fundamental, and our experience is part of our experience feeds back and affects the world, and it's ultimately, coming from beyond space and time. Because consciousness itself is beyond space and time. The universal consciousness is beyond space and time. All conscious experience is fundamentally the experience of that universal consciousness, right? We're all the one mind. The one mind experiencing itself, different fractalizations of itself. And it feeds back and can change itself because we're part of the information structure in that constant feedback loop. And so our minds aren't just created, consciousness isn't just created in the brain. Consciousness is fundamental, and through the feedback of information, our conscious experience feeds back and affects how the world works to whatever extent. Right? So, is there a world that exists out there? Well, is there a world that exists out there as some material substance fundamentally devoid of consciousness? No. Is there a world that exists out there, from our perspective, as certain information geometric sets? Yeah. And so that's what connects us all. And then it connects us all. We're all connected through being part of the feedback loop and the fundamental information set. Yeah, I think I can leave it at there. It's kind of gone on for a while now. But that was basically the point is, so the basic notion of reality and consciousness of the mainstream view, which posits, well, the reality, the fundamental real reality is a non-conscious physical world, and then consciousness comes about, and our conscious experience is only some illusion produced out of it, which doesn't actually feed back and affect the way the world works. And that is their view, okay? Free will is not believed in the mainstream view of materialism and physicalism. It's not. And it's good. It's not. There's no way. There's no mechanism for how it's allowed. But by positing the feedback loop, that what reality is essentially that fundamental feedback loop of geometry information stemming from all as an aspect of the infinite mind. There can be all free will comes because the infinite mind is fundamentally beyond space and time. So the basic hard determinism would be that, all things are determined by previous causes. But this would say that the infinite mind and the previous causes are all the material interaction. And this would say the infinite mind is beyond that, and so it's not bound by those previous causes. Because it's the infinite, not bound within space and time. And the mainstream view thinks our minds are bound and local within space and time, but it's not, according to what I'm saying. Our minds are fundamentally the universal consciousness, which is not bound by space and time. And that's how it's able to feed back and affect what there is, what we perceive. Pretty cool stuff, I think, I think it's definitely pretty cool stuff. So I think we should leave it at that. Thank you for watching. I got links in the comments to certain papers I mentioned and ones that I worked off of but didn't mention. And then the paper I wrote myself, which I didn't call it a paper actually because it's complicated. But whatever the piece I wrote, that kind of basically goes over all this without as much rambling and nonsense that I do in these videos, But thanks for checking it out. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate it, guys.